and some of the medications that have failed. And as you can see, I've worked with a lot of drug companies over the years to try and look at potential agents for the treatment of this tragic condition. And those are some of the companies I've worked for, but that won't influence what we say about the drugs today. So what are we going to do today? Well, what we're going to do is have a quick sort of Cook's tour of what Alzheimer's disease is. There's going to be a little sideways progression to what can we do as individuals to try and prevent ourselves getting Alzheimer's disease. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can do to help treat people with Alzheimer's disease in 2015. And then we're going to have a little sort of look towards the future, what may happen in the future, what may work, what may become available to us in the coming years. So hopefully we'll be able to get through this in a timely fashion, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end of the talk. So what is dementia? Well, the thing is dementia is a word that we use to describe people who've got an illness of the brain that's affected their ability to live their normal life. So dementia can be caused by a variety of conditions, and Alzheimer's disease is just one of those. So, for example, if our memory is significantly impaired, we can't recall what we talked about yesterday or what time it is, that might affect our ability to live independently. And if that's the case, we call the condition a dementia. So the commonest cause of dementia in our community is Alzheimer's disease. And the symptoms that we get in a dementia are affected by what part of the brain is affected. And with various dementias can affect various parts of the brain. So if we look at the front part of the brain, which is here, if we look at that part of the brain, that's the part of the brain that's involved in intelligence, it's involved in judgment, decision making, it's involved in deciding, should I buy this, should I do that, how should I react to people. It's involved in your ability to interpret what other people think. So it's very much, I suppose, what we call the adult part of the brain. Now, if you look at the map here, the colour-coded part is the green. Unfortunately, when you're a surgeon, it's not as easy as that because it's not colour-coded. But on our diagram here is the memory part of the brain. So if you have an illness involving the green part, then the symptoms are going to be memory. The purple part's involved in language. So if the illness affects the language part, then you might have difficulty understanding people or difficulty expressing yourself. So depending on what part of the brain is affected will be what symptoms one gets. Now, Alzheimer's disease is what we're about today. Now, Alzheimer's disease refers to what is under the microscope when a pathologist looks at someone's brain when they've passed on. And it's named after a gentleman who was called Alzheimer, who was a German pathologist, and he described a couple of things on the microscope. What he described were these things, which he called tangles, and he got these things, which he called plaques. And depending on what you stain it with, they're different colours. And if you've got lots of tangles and lots of plaques, then the pathologist will say you have Alzheimer's disease. Now, Alzheimer's disease tends to start in one area of the brain and over many, many years spreads to other areas of the brain. So if you can imagine that as the disease spreads, it affects different areas of the brain, then you're going to find that it will affect different things. So what we're going to do now is talk about how we can prevent Alzheimer's disease. Now, the Alzheimer's disease is a disease that gets more common with age. So the older we are, the more likely we are to get Alzheimer's disease. So in many ways, how do we protect ourselves from Alzheimer's disease is how do we live healthily? How do we protect ourselves from illnesses involved in ageing? Now, the things that we can do is to have a healthy lifestyle. So your doctors will tell you about your cholesterol, They'll tell you about your blood pressure, they'll tell you about not smoking, they'll tell you about not drinking excessively, tell you about gentle exercise. And all of these things can help your body live more healthily, and it can also affect your ability to prevent you to get diseases in the future. So we all know about the healthy heart diet that you see on television, things that are good for you to eat and things that are bad for you to eat. And the theory there is if we eat well, we exercise regularly, then our heart is going to become more healthy, or stay healthy longer, and that also means that the blood vessels to the rest of the body will become less inflamed, less ill. And if we can keep the blood vessels in the heart healthy, then we can keep the organs that they supply healthy. And so if we lead a healthy lifestyle, we'll get less kidney disease, we'll get less diabetes, we'll get less heart disease, and less dementia. Now, what we know is that if you're in middle age and you let yourself go, you have a very high cholesterol, have a very high blood pressure, smoke a lot, you're more likely, when you get to older age, to get dementia than the person who lives healthily. Now, there's a lot of evidence now slowly accumulating to suggest...
Sorry, Alastair, you should move the microphone.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Closer? Yeah. So there's a lot of evidence now to suggest that if you actually do these things, you'll become more healthy in the future. And so there have been some studies that have been done that have looked at people in the 1960s and 1970s when they looked at their general health. And the ones who were healthy in middle age and looked after themselves were less likely to get dementia several decades down the track. So looking after your body will be helpful. Now, I was given an idea that we should talk about physical fitness. And physical fitness is one of the things that is being promoted, and something that we can all do. And if we exercise on a regular basis, then we can actually have some health benefits down the track. So what are the health benefits that you can get? Well, some of the health benefits are that you might live longer, you might live more healthily, with less heart disease. It's good for your mental health, so there's some suggestions that people who exercise regularly have less depression. And there's quite a bit of evidence now slowly accumulating that it's good for your brain. So one of the things that people are trying now is looking at people who are in middle age or late middle age or early old age and saying, if we get them exercising several times a week, go for a walk or go to the gym or go to the pool, let's have a look at what their health benefits are down the track. And there is some evidence to suggest it's going to be beneficial for your brain. So we should all encourage exercise. Maybe we should walk here or walk home. So if we go take people who've now got Alzheimer's disease, what can we do for them? Now, for some of you who are down the back, you might find this diagram a little bit hard to see. But the brain, just to sort of give a background, is a mixture of chemicals and electricity. And so if you think about your nerves in your brain, what they're called neurons, what they are is like a little electrical wire that connects one neuron to another. And those neurons are working reasonably well in Alzheimer's disease, but some of the connections become a bit cruddy. And what are the connections? Well, they're a chemical reaction. So what happens is you have an electrical signal in one neuron that goes to the next neuron. And when it gets there, it releases a chemical that hits the next neuron. And when that chemical goes there, you get another electrical signal. So if you think about if the connection between the two neurons is a bit cruddy, then the signal gets lost. So how can we keep the signals between different neurons going well? Well, one of the big systems in the brain is a system called acetylcholine, or the cholinergic system in the brain. And that's a name according to the chemical that connects the neurons. In an Alzheimer's disease, we don't have enough of those neurons. They're slowly dying out. And so what can we do to try and help those neurons that aren't working properly work better, well, we can take some medications that make that system work more efficiently. And those are the drugs called Aricept or Exelon or Reminol. And they're 3 drugs that work in a similar fashion to work on this system to make it work a bit better. So it's giving the brain a little bit of a helping hand. So it's if people have heard of Parkinson's disease, in Parkinson's disease we have another different chemical system in the brain called dopamine that isn't working. So we give them drugs called Cinnamate or Manipar or so forth that can help the Parkinson's dopamine system work better. And this is the analogy for Alzheimer's disease. We have a system in the brain that's not working very well, and we're going to use drugs called Aricept, Exelon or Reminol to make that work better. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work with everyone, but more people than not seem to get a benefit. And if you get a good benefit, it's like turning the clock back 6 to 12 months. And there's been lots and lots of scientific studies done, and the sort of things that it can help with. It can help with memory or thinking or concentration. It can help people's ability to do things. So there's activities, what we call activities of daily living, which might be making a cup of tea, doing your household chores, doing your hobbies, your interests. And it can also help in terms of behaviour, because one of the things that can get affected in Alzheimer's disease is people's behaviour. So they may become a little anxious, they may become a little agitated, become a bit despondent, have funny, irrational thoughts. There's a variety of things that can occur. And all of those areas have been shown to help. And if those things are helped, then it also helps the carer, because they have less to do. Their spouse or loved one is able to do more for themselves, they're more independent, they get a better sense of joy in their life. There's another drug that we use in Alzheimer's disease called memantine or Ebixa, and that's a drug that works on another chemical system in the brain. The brain is a soup of chemical systems, and this is called the glutamate system. And one way of thinking of the brain is that you've got nerves that are on switches and you've got nerves that are off switches. And the glutamate is an on system. It turns things on. And in Alzheimer's disease, we have some problems with the glutamate system. And memantine, or Ebixa, is a drug that works on that system. So it works in a different way to the other drugs. It's complementary to the other drugs, and it can also similarly have some help with the caveat that we tend to use this drug in patients with more advanced disease, not with early Alzheimer's, but moderately severe Alzheimer's disease. There are other things that can help, and one of the newer things that's become available on the market in the last couple of years is a medical drink, if you like, called Suvinate. Now, the theory behind this is relatively simple. The brain is an active organ that is always making new connections. So when you make new memories, the nerves need certain chemicals to make those new memories stick. Now, in order to make those new memories or the new connections, the brain needs various vitamins, various minerals, and other chemicals that it needs. And so Suvinate you can think of as a brain food. So if you give your brain all these chemicals, then it's better able to make those connections. Now, Suvinate is sold over the counter. You don't need a script for it. And the level of evidence you need in order to sell a vitamin or a foodstuff is much less than the level of evidence you need to sell a drug. But there is some scientific evidence for Suvinate, and it's been used in people with early Alzheimer's. It may or may not be helpful for people who've got some mild sort of ageing memory loss, but that is unknown and is currently being studied. And hasn't been shown to be helpful with people with advanced Alzheimer's disease. So this is a chemical sort of mixture of fish oil, vitamins, minerals and other foodstuffs for the brain that you can use with people with early Alzheimer's disease if you so wish. So that's the medications and medicinal foods that we've got. Now, some of the other things that we deal with in Alzheimer's disease are behaviours. So one of the things that Alzheimer's disease is it can affect the part of the brain that regulates how one behaves. So one way of thinking about it is we've all been in the supermarket where a mum with a 4 or 5-year-old is having a hard time because they're misbehaving and being embarrassing. And that's because that person at that age hasn't learnt all the social rules that are involved in adult conduct. And we sort of take pity perhaps on the mum or the dad who's being embarrassed. But we know that over the years that child will learn how to conduct themselves in a socially appropriate manner. Now, if you think about Alzheimer's disease or some of the other dementias as affecting the parts of the brain where you store your social rules, then you can imagine that as that part of the brain gets affected, some of those rules of social conduct that are acceptable in polite society is lost, and so patients' behaviour may change. Patients can also become more agitated, they become more anxious, they can become more depressed. And all of those symptoms are just as treatable in patients with Alzheimer's disease as they are patients who come to the doctor with depressive illness or an anxiety problem. So all of those things are very treatable by your general practitioner or your specialist, and also amenable to help. Now, one of the things that we can do, and unfortunately a lot of people don't take advantage of, is using some of the services that are out in our community. And that's one of the things that the gang network is trying to promote, is what's available to help people. And the Alzheimer's Association is in Packington Street, and there's a variety of other people who are available, counsellors, there's the Carers Respite Centre, there's a variety of services out there to help people to deal with things. Sometimes it's just a matter of learning which way is it better to handle this problem. There may be a clever way of dealing with a problem, and when you've been in a service situation for many years, you've learnt a few of the tricks of the trade, and if you ask them, they can help you. So, one of the things that I try to emphasise in Alzheimer's disease is it's a disease that affects more than one person. So if you're a couple and one person has Alzheimer's disease, then it's rather natural that the person with the Alzheimer's disease becomes more dependent on the other person in their couple. So it's a sort of a Jack Sprat, could eat no fat type of thing. So the other person takes up some of the memory, or they may start taking over some of the duties. It may have been that one person did all the bills and they've now got Alzheimer's and cannot do the bills, so the other person has to take over the activities. You may need to make sure that people are taking their medications. And what normally happens is it doesn't happen suddenly, it's a gradual thing. And after a while, suddenly you might realise that many, many hours of your life are taken up doing a carer's role, and that can have a deleterious effect on the carer's health. So the carer needs to look after their own health if they are to look after their loved one's health. And one of the things you can do is to ask for help. And the help is there. So we're now going to sort of change direction and get on to some of the research highlights. Now, the research into Alzheimer's is huge. They have conferences a couple of times a year, and there'll be thousands of delegates, so there'll be 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people. And that's only a small proportion of people who are active in the area and doing research. So if you've looked at something on the internet or that I don't mention, it might be I've never heard of it, or it might be that we just haven't got time to talk about it today. But I thought I'd talk about some of the things that I find interesting. Now, the first thing is that everything that goes on telly isn't true. And I know you'll all be very surprised to hear that. But one of the things that happens is that a university or a drug company, and universities are no longer like they used to be. They're just great big, almost, well, not quite multinationals, but they're great big companies that are trying to sell their product, which is giving people certificates. So how do they do it? Well, they try and make the most of any research that's coming on. And often the research that they put on television is designed to promote the company, which is the university or the drug company, rather than to educate us on what's available for us as consumers. So anything that's on TV, just take with a large pinch of salt. Now, how do people do research? Well, people can do research in humans, but it's really tricky, because if you look around the room, we're all very different. And doing research on people who are all very different means that it's a lot harder to get good results. So one of the ways they do research is they do it on the humble mouse, which are inbred strains. So if I go to a company and say I'll have so many mice for my experiment, that those mice will be exactly the same as the mice that someone in Boston or Paris is getting. So the actual research that is done on mice is a very good research technique, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will work in humans. And there's some obvious differences, as one can see from the photo, between us and mice. But things that are reported in mice don't always translate to humans. And part of the reason is mice don't get Alzheimer's disease. They only get Alzheimer's when we give it to them. And we're giving them our version of Alzheimer's, and how real that model of Alzheimer's disease in mice is a cause of much debate. So anything that's reported in the media in a mouse, please take with a grain of salt. Yes, it might work, but I reckon the big probability is it won't work. So there's lots of things that you see on the TV, and so on the left we have a marijuana leaf, and there was an article saying marijuana was going to help people with Alzheimer's disease. There was another thing saying if we transfuse people with young people's blood, they will improve. So that's sort of almost something like that could be in a horror movie. So maybe Rupert Murdoch could afford it, but most of us won't be able to do that. But all of these things are sort of promising research prospects. The marijuana one is that in marijuana there's a compound called tetrahydrocannabinol, and that's a compound that does work in the brain, and it's what gives people their sort of mellow feeling when they're having their marijuana. But it also, people who are big smokers have always talked about the munchies, so they're saying that it increases their appetite. And so what's happened is researchers have said, can we utilise the appetite part of the marijuana effect and take away the high so that people will eat better, and that's what's the work's going on, and it may or may not work. So this is a little cartoon from a guy called Bengt Lindblad, who's one of the sort of gurus of Alzheimer's disease, and what it is sort of a long and winding road, if you like, to drug getting on the market. So one starts off at the bottom of the diagram with the eureka moment, where you jump out of the bath and run naked down the street, like a certain man from Syracuse did, and saying, yes, I've discovered it, eureka. Then you go off to the laboratory. You probably have to get lots of money to pursue the research and multiple meetings, and often that discovery falls and nothing else is heard about it because it's a bad idea. But eventually what happens is they'll try it in animals or in a test tube, and then when they've gone through that, which may take 4 or 5 years, you then start giving it to humans. and that you'll talk about, there's lots of studies that are done in humans, and they talk about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies. And if you're looking at a research program, the earlier the phase, the less likely it is to work. Phase 1 studies are basically how much of a drug can I give you before your hair falls out, or you vomit, or you get chest pains, or feel sick. So it's saying what's a safe dose to give to people. Phase 2 studies, we've worked out what the safe dose is, and then we're trying to find out, should we give it 2 times a day, once a day, 3 times a day, those sort of things. When they're successful, we do phase 3 studies where 1,000 people might get the drug, and 1,000 people might get a pretend pill, and what we're trying to do is find out whether they work or not. And Donald Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of Defence in the Bush era, gave this quote at a press conference. He thought he was talking about why America had buggered up in Iraq, but what he was actually talking about was drug trials. And what he said is there are known knowns. There are things that we know, there are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know that we don't know, but there are also unknown unknowns. There are things that we don't know. Now, that got a lot of publicity when he said it, and he successfully deflected from the journalists who were rather incredulous with that statement about why he had mucked up with not having enough troops on the ground to keep Iraq safe. But what it is in a drug study we ask 2 questions. 1, does the drug work? And 2, is it safe? And if we knew the answers, we'd give you the drug. But we don't know the answers, so that's why we do a drug trial. Sometimes they come up with very unexpected results, the unknown unknowns, and sometimes they just don't work. But that hasn't stopped us, and we're doing lots and lots of work. Now, this is a little schema that some of you might find difficult from the back to read, but we've got 2 things here. We've got your amyloid plaques, and you've got the tangles. Those are the 2 things that we see under the brain microscope in Alzheimer's disease. So the smart money is, well, they're not there normally. They must have something to do with Alzheimer's. What can we do to prevent them occurring, or get rid of them, or change how they are? And maybe if we can change our amyloid or change our tau, we can change Alzheimer's disease. And there's a lot of different areas of interest. So cholesterol is involved in cells. We know that there's a protein in the brain called apolipoprotein, which is involved in cholesterol metabolism. Now, we all have 2 genes for this. One we get from mum, one we get from dad. And there's 3 different versions of this gene. If you have one version, you get less Alzheimer's disease. If you have the other version, you get more Alzheimer's disease compared to the middle version. So that tells us something, that cholesterol metabolism is very important in the brain. So that gives us one lead. We also know that the brain needs a lot of sugar to work, but it needs the sugar in the right level. We know that people with diabetes get more dementia than people without diabetes, so we know that's important. We also know that if we look at a brain under a microscope, there's signs of inflammation, so that must be important. And there's been a theory of ageing that's been around since Adam was in short pants, called the oxidative stress thing. So the more stress you put on the body, the more damage it causes. So that's given people lots of different leads, okay? So all of those people, those ideas are being investigated by different groups of scientists, and that's giving people an idea, how can we modify Alzheimer's, how can we prevent it, how can we treat it. Now, this is a figurative thing, and it's set up like a bullseye. So if you can imagine Robin Hood's aiming for there, that is successful drugs. So those are the drugs we've got on the market, and these are all these little dots are drugs that are in development. Now, the closer they are to the bullseye, the further they are in their development. So these ones have got a long, long way to go. So if you hear about those in the news, they might take 7 or 8 years to go there. These ones here in phase 3, what we call phase 3, that's the make or break phase. If at the end of the study, which might take 2 or 3 years, they're successful, then eureka, champagne all around. If they fail, that's the last you'll hear of them. So this is a schema of some of the drugs that are in development. So which one's going to win? Well, who knows? It might be that one, or it might be that one, or it might be that one. We don't really know. But all of these drugs are in development, and hopefully 1, 2, or maybe even more might actually give us some benefit. You might be able to hear about that and be prescribed that by your doctor. So this is a little bit more on this. And one of the things that was really big development in Alzheimer's disease in about 1995 was that you could immunise mice against Alzheimer's. So don't forget, mice don't get Alzheimer's, we give it to them, but if you gave them an immunisation, we could prevent Alzheimer's in a mouse model. That was on the front page of Nature magazine, which is the best or the most prestigious scientific journal in the world. Now, what then happened was they did a trial with humans. And it was very much, do you want the good news or the bad news trial? The good news was that people were given this immunisation and it got rid of the plaques in the brain. The bad news was that some people had this serious side effect of a meningoencephalitis. That was the unknown. No one expected that to happen. And so that drug has been taken off the market. And what's happening now is people have said, well, can we get the good effect without the bad effect? And because of some people dying of that immunisation, it's been rather slow in development. But it's something that is a big help, or a big boon, I suppose, and may well become successful in the future. So I'm rather hopeful that one of these will show some benefit in the future. And it might be that we'll be immunising people in their 40s to try and prevent them getting Alzheimer's in their 80s, just as we immunise people to try and prevent them getting tetanus or whooping cough. But that's quite a few years away, I suspect. Probably too late for me. Now, there's other ways that are involved in research. And every cell has a little battery in it called a mitochondria. So cells have little energy batteries, and what we know is some of those energy batteries don't work as well with Alzheimer's disease. So there's a bunch of trials going on looking at, can we make the little energy battery called a mitochondria in the cell work better? And if it's working better, the cell's more healthy, and therefore it works better. There's, as I mentioned, cholesterol's important. I told you before that if you've got a certain apolipoprotein called epsilon 4, then you're much more likely to get Alzheimer's disease than people with epsilon 2 version. So can we make people's epsilon 4 work like epsilon 2 and reduce their chances of getting Alzheimer's disease, which makes a lot of sense. So there's work on that. Another thing is the amyloid plaques in the brain. So there's been a theory that it's all about amyloid. It's amyloid plaques in the brain that cause all the damage. And if you can get rid of the amyloid plaques, you can get rid of Alzheimer's disease. There's been a number of trials on, and they've been a bit of a mixed bag. The long and short of it is that people with well-established Alzheimer's disease, these trials have failed. But patients who have got what we call mild memory loss or very early Alzheimer's disease, there seems possibly to be a benefit. So some of these drugs are going to be looked at in people who haven't got Alzheimer's disease but might get Alzheimer's disease. So if you've inherited Alzheimer's, like you've got the gene that's going to give it to you, then these are an ideal candidates for this type of drug trial. So one of the other things that's in the brain is what's called tangles. Now, the money in research has been amyloid for the last decade. And there's been a bunch of researchers who said, hey, what about tau? We've got tangles and we've got plaques. We're ignoring half the story. And so more recently, there's been a couple of drugs that have been trialled in tau metabolism. There's one called methylene blue that got a bit of publicity a couple of years ago as the next best thing in Alzheimer's disease, but we're still waiting on those results. And unfortunately, drug trials take several years to do, so we're patiently waiting for the tau results to come through. There's other drugs. So there's a thing called resveratrol, I think it is, or something like that, which is an ingredient that's found in some vegetables, some fruits, and red wine. Red wine's been the elixir of life for many of us for many a year, and it's been shown to be of some benefit in heart disease, and there's been studies that came from a place called Bordeaux that said that people who drink Bordeaux Reds get less Alzheimer's disease. Some of us thought, well, the French would say that, but one of the active ingredients in red wine is thought to be this thing called resveratrol, which is thought to be like an anti-aging compound. So if you want a glass of red wine, you can say you're trying to prevent aging. Now, another thing that's been coming on in the research is why wait until people get Alzheimer's disease before we treat them? Can we treat them before they get Alzheimer's disease? And so there is a scan that's available in a research setting which can look for amyloid in the brain. That's the amyloid plaques in the brain. And you can see amyloid many years before people get Alzheimer's disease. So if you've got amyloid in the brain and you're entirely normal as far as we can see, then why don't we give you some medication to try and stop that getting worse and prevent Alzheimer's disease? And so there's now trials of this going on overseas, so with other drugs. So there's an awful lot that's happening in the literature. I can't actually offer you anything new yet, and but that's what's going on. There's also some research going on in the prevention stage with various vitamin mixtures. Anti-inflammatories have been known for years to reduce your chance of getting Alzheimer's disease. There was research from about 30 years ago showing that people with rheumatoid arthritis got less Alzheimer's disease than people without rheumatoid arthritis. And one of the questions that was asked is, why does that happen? And some of the evidence would suggest that it's the anti-inflammatories that people were taking for rheumatoid arthritis were helping to prevent Alzheimer's disease. Now, the rheumatoid arthritis is obviously a nasty condition with its own problems, but that evidence from that condition is being translated into drug trials to try and prevent people getting Alzheimer's disease with anti-inflammatories. So there's a variety of things that are being done in prevention. And again, there's local trials that are available. We promote research in Alzheimer's disease because if we don't do it, then we can't improve people's outcome in the future. We've got a trial that's going to be available later on this year, and this is for people who are under the age of 80 with early Alzheimer's disease, who are going to be trialled on a couple of medications to see whether they prevent Alzheimer's disease. Now, in the old days, what they did is they said, oh, we'll take the wonder drug. Some people get it, some people get the pretend drug, and our wonder drug might work on tau, or it might work on amyloid. Well, this trial, which is run by the Howard Florey Institute in Melbourne, is looking at two different drugs. So we're saying let's work on tau, let's work on amyloid, and see whether that can improve people's outcomes. Now, will it work? Who knows? But if we don't do the research, we won't get the answers. So that brings to a conclusion my talk. I'm happy to take any questions.